Teachers, feel free to, raise your hand either by raising your hand or doing the electronic hand raising, or jot some questions into the chat, and I will collect them and send them on to Lorri as they arise. So, questions, discussion points? Lorri, let me ask you a question that arises in my mind simply because of Washington's iconic status in the United States, not only now, but then, right? Turning over his commission, walking away from power, and all that other stuff. How did those who defended the Articles of Confederation and the style of government that it created, how did they deal with his criticisms? Because here you have somebody who is a national figure criticizing the government that they wish to defend.
So I have always thought that it is deeply revealing how close the Constitution came to failing, given the fact that it was widely known, that Washington was a strong advocate for the Constitution. He had presided over the Philadelphia Convention. He didn't participate in the Virginia Ratification Convention, but he was in person, but he was very much involved. He was an advocate on paper. He kept close tabs on what was going on in all the ratification conventions. It was widely understood that if the Constitution was adopted, that Washington would become the first president. It's hard for us, I think, to imagine today the overwhelming confidence that people had in Washington's leadership and the reverence that they held and the trust that they invested in him. But given all of that, when Virginia ratified the Constitution, I think there were like 168 delegates, and it passed by 5 votes, only 5 votes. It was a sort of tight in Massachusetts, very tight in New York. So in all of these critical states, despite the fact that Washington was zealous for and going to be at the head of the federal system. And we might add, Benjamin Franklin is an advocate as well. All of these leading figures in all of the states and the national figures come out in support of the Constitution. And I think, if you read the writings of anti-federalists, they announce that they may respect those views, but they will not defer to other men's judgment, that they have a right to judge for themselves what is the best path forward for their state and how they imagine their country. And so thinking about how controversial the Constitution was, thinking about how the ratification debates reveal the erosion of deference and the shift of political culture in the 18th century is, I think, really valuable for us in teaching students about history, but also about civics.
And Denver Brunsman, who will be speaking in a couple of weeks, will talk about the arguments about between the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. And one of the things about the Anti-Federalists is they didn't have a unified voice. There were many different voices among the Anti-Federalists, and so they didn't have a coherent program per se. They were basically, winners write histories, and we call them the Anti-Federalists because they lost. They lost to the Federalists. The Washington thing has always been of interest to me. We've got some questions here. Does anybody want to verbally give their question, or do you want me just to work through the chat here? Absent anybody verbalizing, and feel free to do so, let me just roll through some of the questions. Were there other rebellions or riots in other states other than Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts?
Right. There were. Shays' Rebellion was the most, it became the most famous. It was the most widespread. It was deeply troubling, got reported in all the newspapers. But there were, similar actions in other states of shutting down courts that were trying to foreclose on farmers' property. And there were the passage of so there was extra legal activism, but there was also within the states and the state legislatures legal actions that advantaged debtors and pensioners over creditors, and both of those, both the popular rebellions as well as the legislative changes, were distressing to people who were focused on the social order, and especially on the international reputation of the United States. And that too, I think, is really, sort of thinking about the response of patriot leaders to Shays's rebellion, as opposed to some of those same men's responses to, the Boston Tea Party 12 years before. So one is seen as an expression of defending liberty against tyranny, and the other is seen as destructive to social order. So it's I do a thing with my students when they say the founders thought or the founders believed. I always say, wait a minute, who and when? Who are you talking about? And when do you mean? So people's ideas, patriot leaders' ideas about street violence was very different in 1765 with the Stamp Act crisis, in 1768 with the Townsend duties, in 74 in Boston, than it became in 76 with Shays's 86 with Shays's rebellion, and I've forgotten now the date of the Whiskey Rebellion, but that happened during Washington's administration, and it's a similar kind of a thing, right? So what at one point people thought of positively, they begin to as they begin to think of as dangerous. We can see that in our own world today, right? So when does a protest become a riot? That's in the eye of the beholder.
We've got two electronic hands raised. Velasta, is it Velasta? Okay, Velasta, you came up first. Ben Howard, you're on deck, as we say in baseball circles.
So I teach weaknesses and strengths. It's in our TEKS, but you made the comment that it's easier to find them. So would it make more sense to teach what's easier to find first?
Well, first of all, it's good to see you again.
Yes, and I need to get with you.
So I think maybe the question of strengths and weaknesses is to ask a similar question that I just asked, like, who thought these were strengths and weaknesses, and when did they think that, right? So John Dickinson is not a foolish person. He's one of the principal architect of the Articles. And the decentralized power, the rotation of office, the annual elections, that seemed like a logical expression of the values and principles for which the Patriots have fought. And it seemed like a logical and reasonable counter to the British system. So, if you're asking at the time, many people thought annual elections and term limits was a fantastic idea. We can look back and see how that played out, in the next 5 years or so, and think about, well, then people who have expertise have been turned out of office. You have this steady rotation of people who are constantly having to learn the rules, who don't have, political experience. So, I think it might make sense to start with the strengths, because that would get the students to thinking about an 18th century context as opposed to a 21st century context. But I think we also have to discern with them whose point of view we are emphasizing.
Okay, so sorry, real quick.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of it, I'm 8th grade, so I'm younger. But in the grand scheme of it, I technically we teach an acronym of how to remember the weaknesses of it. So on the further end of the aspect of strengths in that way versus, because I think we hit weaknesses just because they're tested.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
and you have to make sure that you're fulfilling the responsibilities that you have and the state standards. So I get that. I'm hoping that there is a place when listing the weaknesses to think about, again, who thought that, and what might be another way of thinking about, so there's no there's no central judiciary. That might seem to us on the face value as completely counterproductive, right? What if somebody from Maryland sues somebody from Virginia? What state court adjudicates? But why might people have been fearful of a central judiciary? That's a good question to ask.
And in fact, I think one of the things, and Benjamin, you're up on deck. One of the things that you can do is take a look at the arguments for the Articles of Confederation and then compare them to arguments today against a stronger national government. I mean, these conversations have been going on throughout the course of American history. We just keep cycling back through them in different ways. Benjamin, you're on.
Okay, so I guess mine kind of segues into this one kind of nicely. So like when they talk about the Philadelphia Convention to like create the revise and create the Constitution, you always hear about the people that like, yeah, we need to do this. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Madison. Was there anyone like, hey, this is working decently enough? Can we just keep it? Was there any notable people, or was it just kind of like just some no names that never did anything? No one knows them.
Well, that's a good question, Mr. Howard. I think it goes back to what Joe was saying a bit ago about the challenge that the opponents to the Constitution have, in fact, is that there is no uniform, there's no consensus, there's no uniform policy that they are pursuing. The advocates of the Constitution, I mean, so they're the people in the room who are designing it. 3 refuse to sign it. They have their own particular reasons, and I can elaborate on that. But I think your question is about like the response, like, does anybody say, let's hang on to the articles? I think there is almost universal acceptance that some parts of the articles need to be revised. Now, how far the revisions go, what those need to be, if the Constitution has gone entirely too far in this, that, or the other direction, like that's an open-ended question. For the advocates for the Constitution, at least during ratification, their only goal is to ratify. That's it. Like, we are for the Constitution. We want it ratified. And the opponents, some would say, Patrick Henry famously was upset with the preamble. Said, what do they mean, we the people? They have no authority to speak about we the people. It's we the states. So, it started there. And some people were like, well, let's go back to the articles and tweak those. Let's go back to this design and rein in some of those excesses. But I'm not sure you could find many people who would say, let's keep the articles exactly as they are.
So it was more of like everyone kind of agreed they needed some fix. It was just the extent to the fix was, let's just tweak a few things to, this ain't working.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
No one at the Constitutional Convention wanted to leave everything status quo. There were degrees of attachment to stronger national government. And this actually leads to a question that Isaiah raises in the chat bar. Was there opposition to the articles at the beginning of its implementation?
Yeah, I mean, it took a long time for the articles to actually be ratified by the states. And you can see in that long process, some of the systemic problems with the articles, in particular requiring consensus, right? So all of the states had to approve any changes to the articles, and all of the states had to approve the articles for them to be affected. That's very different than under the Constitution. 9 of 12 were involved, 9 of 13 perhaps needed to approve the Constitution. So you can see some structural flaws in that system. So absolutely, there were there were skeptics of the decentralized part of the Articles of Confederation. And, then there were holdouts about, land in the West, and that kind of thing. So there were different reasons why leaders in different states were divided about the Articles, and why ultimately that, they were slow walked.
There's time for one more question before we turn to your treatment of original source documents.
Okay.
And it flows into what you were just talking about, Lorri. The question from let's see, Natalie. Do you have any specific examples of international threats or challenges that the Articles were not equipped to handle? Because one of the arguments in favor of the Constitution was we are facing all sorts of international threats.
Right. So just to jump ahead to Washington's circular letter, I want to read, let's see if I can find this really quick. Washington laid out the international context that so worried many critics of the Articles. The eyes of the whole world are turned upon us, them. This is the moment to establish or ruin national character forever. So there was tremendous concern about the standing of the United States in an international arena. So that international arena is both Atlantic and continental, right? So the threats are to imperial powers out of Europe. There's a French presence remaining in parts of North America, the Spanish in the Caribbean and Central and South America. Britain controls Canada and interior regions as well. And then there are native nations and confederacies and empires in the continental United States that are threatening. So there is concern about being able to fund soldiers' pensions, which the Confederation Congress cannot do, and what that might mean if there was, a war in what 18th century people called Indian country. There is also the concern about parts of the states being drawn into what sort of the economic circle of European imperial powers because of trade, or of simply being invaded. And so these are, it seems to me, given the short, volatile history of the United States, these are very reasonable concerns to have in the 1780s, that there would be a war in the West that could not be supported, that there would be a fracturing of the colony of the states along trade alliance lines, or that Britain would come back in, or another European power would come back in and just take over the North Americans. They couldn't defend themselves.
And this will roll into your discussion of Washington Circular. One of the things that is difficult to convince students of, and this is true even at the college level, is that the Constitution's success was preordained. It was inevitable. Nothing is inevitable. And in fact, as Lorri said, I mean, you got the French, the British, and the Spanish surrounding it. And what have the French, the British, and the Spanish been doing for the last 300-400 years in Europe? They've been fighting one another, right? And so there's nothing inevitable about this grand experiment actually coming to fruition. And Washington saw some of those dangers, which is the segue to Lorri's discussion of the circular and her documents.
Okay, maybe I'd just say one other thing, which is if you read the debates in Philadelphia, or the ratification debates that unfolded afterwards, there is this tremendous fear of being unable to defend the country, being open to invasion. And then there are also these really grandiose claims about you know, the United States being a latter-day Roman Republic, they are sort of leading the world into a new future, that they want to be on an international stage as a peer to these, you know, global powers that, as Joe was saying, have been colonizing for hundreds of years. And so there is there's like both a reasonable fear, and then there's a kind of an unfounded audacity of hope in all of those conversations. And when the advocates for the Constitution make those arguments about a global stage and you know, a world history legacy, some of the anti-federalists, to Mr. Howard's question, are like, what does that have to do with liberty? What does that have to do with citizens' rights and representative government? That's not what we've been rebelling against Great Britain from. Okay. If there are other questions, I'm happy to entertain them. I did have a few documents that I wanted to walk through, if I can find them. I think they're right here, and share with you sort of strategies for thinking about teaching some of these concepts. So when I teach the Articles of Confederation, I often begin with two images. I'm just going to start with this one. And I do that, you know, exercise that we often do with students in image analysis. And I ask them, first of all, what do you see? You know, if you begin by saying, you know, let's analyze this image, they're worried about, you know, what their peers think about them, or that the idea might not be correct. So beginning with just, what do you see? I asked them to tell me what they see. So I'd like some of you all to just jump in and tell me either what you see or what your students think, or what you think your students will see in this image. Just, what do you see?
A sinking ship.
And somebody said, well, I'm usually.
The waves are higher than the outside.
Keep going. Because you're right so far. It's a sinking ship. The waves are coming from the outside. They're overwhelming the ship. What else do you see?
Probably a really basic one, but the ship has Articles of Confederation written on it.
I don't think that's too basic at all, right? Like,
Everything's negative.
Okay, so we've got the ship. It's at sea. It's sinking, buffeted by waves. It is representing the Articles of Confederation. And Velasta, what did you say?
That everything's negative. Like, no, 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 no.
Right. Absolutely. Everything is negative. No power to collect taxes, no power to raise an army, no power to enforce law, no power to enforce treaties, no national court system. Is there anything else you see?
Well, I'm thinking that the articles are the sails, obviously. Are those sails powerful enough to break through that sea? They're not powerful enough.
Okay, good. It seems like this ship is simply ill-equipped for this body of water. So the second question, you know, in this exercise, and probably some of you do it, is first is, what do you see? Then second, what do you wonder? What do you not know? And my students are more comfortable saying, well, I wonder this rather than I think this. So what do you wonder?
My students, when I did this with them, their question was, where are the people?
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I thought. We look at it and who's manning the ship, who's navigating.
Very good. You wonder, where are the people? Anything else you wonder?
You wonder what direction it's heading.
Good.
Why do you keep going towards something if you're sinking?
So these are, I mean, we could spend a lot of time, as you all could with your students, puzzling through these questions. The last question that I asked them, so it's, what do you see? What do you wonder? What do you think? And sometimes they're reluctant to say what they think, but then I can say, well, tell me the story that this drawing tells you. What do you think the story is in the drawing?
Where are the sailors? Where are the people
Yes, that's a
who are
very
going to steer the ship? Like, who's the who's going to steer us? Who's the captain?
there
Is
you
it-
go. And we know from reading the articles that there in fact isn't a captain, right? Like there's a rotating chair of the Confederation Congress, but there's no president, there's no figurehead. There is no captain. So
Well,
then
are they hiding behind a document?
maybe. Then I show them this image. And I ask the same questions again. What do you see in this image? Another boat, right?
There's a captain.
There is a captain. The
But-
captain is
but-
Virginia. Yes,
But the states are not all rowing in the same direction.
absolutely.
And then
Some aren't
you see the
really-
rocks. They could hit the rock, but then on the other side of the rock, it's like it says anarchy.
Right.
So, okay.
Well, some of those states aren't really rowing at all. So there's no unity there. There's nothing to keep the union together. And if that continues, it's going to go off that cliff into anarchy, basically. That's what I get
Right.
from it.
She went to the independence.
I like what Christine said. She said Congress does not have an oar. So Congress is there as a figure, but isn't doing anything.
Yeah, I think Congress is giving a direction, but is anybody listening to them? Because it looks like New Hampshire and Georgia are hitting each other with the sticks.
Yes, and Pennsylvania's standing up in the boat. Like, okay, you can't stand up in a boat and hope for anything. But so we would go through that same, like, what do you see? What do you wonder? What do you think? And we would tell the story. I would ask the students then to tell the story of the articles from this artist perspective, as opposed to this artist perspective. And then I would go back and ask for like, how do you compare the two? How do you compare the interpretation here versus the interpretation here?
And think about what those obstacles, what the rocks are, right?
Right.
Well, I like how the first one, even though everything's negative, is lighter and this one's darker.
Right. One of the things I hope that my students will see is, I think it's to Kimberly's point, if they could all sit down in the boat and listen to the Congress lead them in the same direction, they might be able to navigate independence and avoid the rocks and avoid anarchy, right? Like that is possible. They've got the boat is not ill-suited to the water. It's the people, right? Represented by the states that are making the decisions. And that's very different from this drawing, right? Not the problem is the articles itself, not the states, not the people within the states. And so that there's a way of sort of thinking about perspective, thinking about what systems of government work and why they work and why they don't work, and comparing and I went the wrong way, and comparing and contrasting the two. I'm going to look at my clock and make sure I'm not going over. Okay, let me show you a couple of other things, and then we'll come back and do some textual analysis in the time that we have left. Sometimes this is the slide I showed you early on about representation, who and what is represented, how and why. I teach freshmen, so they're 18, 19 years old, but it might be an exercise that you could do in AP history or even in 8th grade. I don't know about in 5th grade. But to have students working groups doing research and thinking about representation and who is represented, how and why, it works well with my students, but I'm thinking it would work even better with students who cannot vote, because most of the students I'm teaching, unless they're international students who are studying in this country, can vote in, you know, regional, state, and national elections. But how do people who cannot vote, how theoretically are they represented, or are they not? Or in the case of the articles, like, is it even people who are represented, or is it states? These are 3 of my favorite sources for taking deep dives into this topic. I don't know how many of you have used Founders Online. It's tens of thousands of documents, word searchable, all of the papers projects of the leading members of the founding generation. So Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Adams, Franklin, so on and so forth. Everything that they wrote, everything that was written to them. And I made links on some of the slides to, you know, like Washington's circular letter is on founders.archives.gov. Correspondence between Washington and Madison about the ratification process it is there. Yale Law School has this Avalon project. It's an older site, but it has the text of all of the state constitutions, of the articles, Madison's notes on the Philadelphia Convention. I use it for the 18th century, but they have documents from the 15th century and from the 21st century. So if you are looking for a political document of any sort, not a private correspondence, but a political document, congressional records, state constitutions, that kind of thing, that's on the Avalon Project. Have any of you ever done Race to Ratify with your students? And I can't see everybody, so somebody will have to say, yeah.
I attempted to do that with one. I was successful with one class. I teach 12th grade U.S. government. So I'm still a little bit shy to try it again, but I'm willing to try it again.
Okay.
It's just, I don't know, I guess maybe if I had like another teacher's example of how they were able to do it, because I really liked it. I was like, oh, this is a really good, you know, it just takes some time and needing them more, I guess, say directions in giving it to them.
Yeah,
you know?
well, it does take time, and there's setup time, Ms. Chandler. I think you're absolutely right about that. But it does open up the ratification debates to students in accessible language, and it engages them as participants in the ratification process. Just 2 weeks ago, iCivics, in partnership with Mount Vernon, created the Constitutional Compromise game. They've had a soft opening for it, but it's ready to go for Constitution Day if you want to work with the students through compromises in the Constitution. So those are things that I think are useful, and that I, especially in the case of Founders Online in the Avalon Project, if I'm ever in doubt about, you know, the content of something or the text of something, that's my first stop. And if students have questions, those are the first places that I send them.
Hey, I was just gonna tell her the way that I learned is to find another one that's easier and simple and assign it earlier in the year so they get the concept of the program before you do it. Because the Race to Ratify is a lot harder and a lot more in depth.
The only thing is my class is a semester only class.
Yeah.
So I won't have them all year. So
I used it.
but
I
thank
used
you
it.
for the suggestion.
I used it last year with my 8th graders, and it was pretty good. Like they enjoyed it. I mean, I also use that a lot as just like, hey, you're done your like iCivics in general is just, hey, you're done your test, like do this. So like my kids like the do I ever write game? And like literally in my classroom there is a scoreboard of highest scores
Oh,
in my
wow.
class throughout the year, and it goes up every test because they figure out all the little specifics and they get quicker at it. So
Well,
it's fun.
that's
They,
great.
yeah, my kid, they like it. Like the gamer kids in particular love that stuff.
So I know we're at the end, we're near the end of our time, and Joe probably going to come on and tell me I'm going over. I have two we're not going to go through the documents, but the way we went through the image analysis, we can also do, or you can do in your classes and with your students with documents. I have bolded Article 5 of the Articles of Confederation, parts of it, and this is bolding from Washington's circular letter to the states. And instead of what do you see, I do the reading out loud. And then I say, what do you hear? And then I have students do a translation. So this is 18th century language. Tell me what you think it means in the 21st century. So delegates shall be annually appointed in such matter as the legislature of each state shall direct, with a power reserved to each state to recall its delegates or any of them at any time within the year and send others in their stead. And so we would puzzle through, like, do they know what in their stead means? Such a manner we would go through that word, but rather than having the students read it on page or on their devices, it's helpful to them if I say it, and then we go through, like, what did you hear? And in going through, annual elections, recall at any time, each state has one vote, we can discern that all of the states are equal, and the states decide who's going to represent them in the Congress. And if they don't like somebody, they can just recall them for whatever reason at whatever time. That's obviously not the system we have today. And we have good conversations in my classes about, what if there were term limits in the 21st century to the US Congress? What if there was the ability to recall your representative at any time from the US Congress or from the state legislature? So I'm going to just stop sharing. All those materials are in the files that Liz is going to share with you all. I just don't want to infringe any more on your evening, because I know you've had a long day and you've been kind to listen.